Oh, thank you. Well, thank you to Diane and David, and for allowing me to come and talk. So originally, this talk was called Temp Path and Pytest because I thought I had found a gem. I thought I had found something that was going to be super awesome, and more importantly, I then learned that things don't always work the way that you expect them to. So a much better talk, and I cleared it with David, and he gave me the okay, was working with files in Pytest. And it's still going to cover a little bit what we talked about at first, but it's going to also share a little bit more knowledge. A little bit about me. I'm Jay. I do a podcast. It's called the Productivity in Tech Podcast, where I interview developers, people in the tech space about what they're doing. I am developing a static site generator called Render Engine, which is kind of going to be the focus. You'll see some Render Engine code in this. I also work on another project called Transcriptor, which is a transcription wrapper for AWS Transcribe. And if you want to follow me doing all of my other fun stuff, streaming and all that, you can do so on Twitter. So I'm going to start this by saying testing is hard. And I learned that. It was very, very challenging to learn why some of the things were happening the way that they were. So I asked for a little bit of forgiveness. If for some reason I have a syntax error in my tests, just ignore them. That shouldn't take away from what I'm trying to point out here. But I also want to use this as a way to let you know that test what you can. And if you're going to test real data, like I would advise against it because it's dangerous and it should be avoided. I've lost entire podcasts that way. So yeah, don't do that. So here was the scenario. I was working on Render Engine. For those that don't know, which is pretty much all of you, basically Render Engine works on the page system, which is everything is a page. At the end of the day, everything becomes a page. You can have a single page, a collection of single pages, or a site of single pages and collections. That's how everything works here. From that, you can actually take a markdown file and say, here's a path. And as you can see what this code says, if that path exists, then read the text. This is great. It's pretty easy to read code. It's pretty simple. The stuff at the bottom says, there's going to be some metadata at the top. Separate that from the code itself. So the goal here was to test that the content was processed properly, that bottom line there, the valid adders thing is actually happening, and that the page object, and that everything works as expected when the object has a content path. Or in other words, when given this content here, then the attribute of the page should be just test header, test paragraph. That's it. That's all we're testing here. But because we're working with files, I learned that there's a lot that has to go in that's involved with that. The biggest thing is, one, here's just an easy way to pretend. You'll see this later, this content function here. I created it as a fixture just so I didn't have to write the same thing over and over and over again. So if you see, equals content in something, just know that it's going to be returning this. So there's some options here. When you're working with files in Pytest, of course, you could just create a file, put some data in it, test it. You could create a temp file using Python's built-in temp file library. You could use, it's not built-in, it's a part of standard library. You can import it. You can use Temp Path, which is a part of Pytest and is available by default. Or you could go that really fun route at the bottom, which is mocking, which we'll get to at the very end. Originally, this talk was all about mocking, and we changed it. So creating a file, really simple. Create your path, give it a folder, add some content to it. As you can see here, we added all that data in there. And then we said, here's our page object. Let's create it. And we're going to assert that underscore content is equal to what we expect. This works perfectly fine. So here's the thing. Easy to read, easy to write. However, there's no automatic cleanup. That's something that you'll see a lot of. And then also, it could be slow when you're processing a lot of files. Another thing that you'll see a lot of here. So I think in this case, this is a really good example of how you can do something if you got like a one-off, you only need to test like one file, has very little data, and you're off to the races. The next one is you can use Temp Path. Again, this Temp Path is built into Pytest. It's pretty good. We can kind of walk through it here. Basically, it's this exact same code as before, except for instead of when we create our fake path, which is a directory, we just load in Temp Path, and it handles the creating of a directory for us. Now, one would think with a name like Temp Path that it just cleans itself up and everything is great. It's still easy to read, it's still easy to write. However, that is not true. Pytest's Temp Path built in only cleans up every third, I think by default, anything older than the third time that Temp Path has been created. So while in most cases this won't be a problem, if you're working with a lot of files and you're doing a lot of testing, you could run into some space issues. And also you are physically writing files, so there is a processing problem there. Now, there is one way to bypass this, and that is if you use the base temp flag here. Now, what that'll do is it won't delete the last instance, but it will delete anything that's currently in that path. So if you want to keep the last bit of data and you want an easy way to get to it, this is how you do it. We talked about the temp file thing that Python has in standard library. You create it as a context. You say with temp file, temp directory, all the same stuff. And this is the only way that you can physically write, and it does automatic cleanup as long as you have it within that context of with temp file, temporary directory. If you do it another way, you kind of have to close it, and then once you close it, it deletes it. But to me, this is actually how I was doing things before I learned about Temp Path. Again, a little bit harder to read and write, but it's still pretty easy. Cleanup happens immediately. Now, all of the things here are slow when it comes to processing files. The biggest hang up here is if you have slow drives, or if you're, having to test somewhere on a system that doesn't have a lot of resources, this could be a problem. You can use the mock patch object here and say, you create a mocker for your object that you're working with, and then you say whenever this function is ran, so in this case it's read text return value, then give it some data, and then you test it. You have to be really careful with mocking, because one of the things that I ran into a lot was I wasn't really testing anything. I was just testing the exact data that I mocked in. I was testing that methods were being called, which is important in some cases, but when you're actually wanting to test if files work properly, not so much. But there are pros to this. There's no writing to disk. It allows the measurement of times called with what data. And a lot of this could be talked about in a better talk about mocking, or the 1,500 blog posts I had to read about how to make mocking make sense, none of which succeeded. And of course, some of the cons there, it's harder to read and comprehend. And if you change the back end process, like I said, anytime you change something, you run the risk of breaking the mock, but then you also run the risk of not really testing anything. So that's it. These are your 4 options. I'm sure there are other options. I would love to hear about them. There are cleanup things that you can do where you can create your own plugins. You can create your own fixtures that do stuff at the end. Of course, some of these all write to disk and are fairly easy to read. Some are a little bit harder to read, a little bit harder to fully understand what's going on. And some you should probably only use in like cases where you know that you need to be using it. So just a quick note, if anybody wants to check out my podcast, that's what it's called. Again, I interview developers all the time. I am currently interviewing for developer advocate and software engineering roles. And if you have any information on that, my email address is there. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Jay.
Are there any questions? I got a question, but if you send me a message, I'll let you know about that, because it's more about the podcast, not about the talk.
You should promote your podcast. Give
Okay.
us the 30-second pitch.
Okay, the 30-second pitch is it's called Productivity in Tech. It's not really about productivity, mostly about the tech side of things. It's a bi-weekly interview series. Episodes come out every single week. One week it's just me talking, the other week it's me talking with someone else. I interview people, developers. Some of them are in this chat, and we talk about what they're doing and the how behind it, how they get things done.
Jay, this is Jorge. I have a question.
Hey, Jorge.
Just to satisfy my curiosity, which method did you end up using in the end, and what was your consideration in making that choice?
In the end, I actually used a combination of a couple of these. The one that I used most was the temp path with setting up a base path. And that was mostly because temp path puts it in like this var directory. And if you restart your computer, that will actually delete everything. So it's just easier if you have it in a single path that you know is safe, and you can go back and review your last test, but at the same time it's only going to have one instance. I saw there was another comment there that said they can relate when you have 1,500 blog posts that don't work. Like, nobody wants to write 1,500 files to your file system. And with temp path, the way that it works is every third iteration of temp path it starts doing some cleanup. So that's kind of a good way to do it. It's a good middle ground. I wound up in the end using a little bit of mock for something else, and I think I actually do like write some things to file just to make sure that they're being written and then deleted. So one of the features of Render Engine is that you can set it to always clean out your output file before it gets started, so you always have a fresh website. So when you test that stuff, you kind of have to write stuff there first. So I think it's there is no best answer in this case, and I think ultimately you just have to kind of understand what would be the downside of each, and fully understand what's happening. There was a slide in here that did say at one point there was a issue to fix the temp path logic so that you could always tell it to delete, but I wound up taking that out after having a good conversation with the some of the developers of Pytest.
Very cool. Thank you.